You're listening to 3 Days Through the Wood, a novel by Bear Mawasaki, as read by the author. Chapter 16. The Straw Hat Girl. At the far edge of an odd little town, at the end of the hall in an odd little house, an odd young girl sat, surrounded by her books. Through the spellwork of ink and paper and vivid imagination, alone in her room she could become almost anyone and go almost anywhere. The words wove worlds around her, and the walls of her odd little room would fall away, the surrounding farm would fade from view, and she would look on a changed land and witness sights and sounds both beautiful and fearsome. From the comfort of her room she lived out 100 lives, but no matter how wondrously those lives were crafted, no matter how dearly she wished to stay in those delightfully detailed worlds, she had also died 100 deaths come the turning of the final page. "Catherine, come on downstairs," her mother called. The sound of the family gathering their coats and boots echoed up the rickety stairwell and across the crooked little hall. "We're going to be late." Patterned stars danced softly on the ceiling by the light of an electric lantern. Catherine wiped the tears from her eyes, set down the book she had been reading, and stood on unsteady legs. The wind outside was howling in the way it always did before the very worst kind of storms. It was a terrible day for rain. She couldn't understand why the family was even bothering. "Come on, Cat," yelled Jess. 8 years younger than her and living life 8 times as quick. Rare was the occasion her younger sister could wait for anything. "We're going to see Dad." "We should go before the rain gets too bad," called Izzy. He and Jess were twins, and where she had been born with all their drive, he was the communal keeper of their common sense. "Best not to keep the truck idling long," her older brother said. Paul's voice was somber, matured too soon. It carried through the walls of the old house as most sounds did, even when he tried to speak quietly. "You could all just go on ahead, you know. I can catch up with Kat later." "We're going together," said their mother, in a tone that brooked no argument. "Yeah," another voice scoffed. Laura, the oldest sister. "Like you'd really want to make that drive alone with her anyway." Catherine listened to the sounds of the oldest bickering amongst themselves as they frequently did, and then the youngest were laughing. Their mother whispered harsh admonishments, but the sharp sound still carried up the stairs. Catherine was no stranger to people laughing at her. Laura and Paul were older than her by 4 and 5 years, respectively. Practically adults already with what their family had gone through, and, much like the twins, they seemed to have a closer bond with each other than they did with her. Catherine hadn't forgotten their long years of teasing quite so easily as they had. Her mother said something else that was too quiet to hear, but everyone finally settled down. "Catherine," she called sternly, "downstairs, now!" Catherine left her book on the small bed in the corner, page down and open to where she'd left off the story. Even though she could see she was nearing the end, the story didn't feel anywhere close to complete. There were too many things left to be resolved in too short a time. "I'm coming," she said, not having to speak very loudly at all. No one ever needed to speak loudly in this house unless they were out in the fields, and then it didn't seem to matter how loud you shouted. Walking through the wheat was like being lost in a world of golden silence. It was comforting, an enveloping sort of emptiness that she craved more and more often lately, and missed dearly now that the harvest had stripped the fields clean. She tried in vain to smooth out her hair before giving up. The nest on her head was more an experiment in how tangled a knot could grow than it was a hairstyle, but she at least flattened it enough to cram it beneath the hat hanging from the back of her door. Wide-brimmed straw cut off half her vision from the world, and with her head turned down she could almost block out the rest of it. They were supposed to dress nice tonight, she knew, but she didn't understand why. Not bothering to grab a coat or a sweater or anything else at all because she didn't see the point, she unbundled her shirt that had bunched while reading and crept down the hall. Wind followed her over the worn floorboards and whispered through the cracks like the mutterings of yesterday's ghosts at her feet. Catherine felt she was hearing those more and more lately, in the quiet between the rumblings of family. Everyone downstairs was already set to go. "You're wearing that?" her mother tutted. She was short and round, and from somewhere in the folds of her many-layered jackets and blouses and shawls she produced a hairbrush. Catherine backed away instinctively. "I'm not going at all." she said, tugging nervously at her sleeve. At the surprise in her mother's face, she added hastily, I feel sick. I just want to lay down if that's all right. Laura didn't hide her lack of surprise, nodding to herself with her nose in the air, wearing that better-than-you expression that had become so common to her. Paul nodded as well, but without a sense of smugness or irritance, like he had simply come to expect that she would let the family down somehow. The twins, meanwhile, were erupting in protest. With a sharp raise of her hand, her mother quieted them. Mother's eyes were looking more sunken these days, more weary as the months passed by, but she still carried herself with the unspoken certainty of a figure always in charge, and everyone followed her lead. We're all going together, she said, her voice gentle but firm. We're going to support each other tonight as a family. Paul, Laura, would you two get the twins buckled up, please? We can do it ourselves, Mom, Izzy offered. We're 7. We know how seatbelts work, Jess complained. In the car, Paul, please. We won't be needing the truck tonight. If you say so, but I'm still driving, said Paul, grabbing the keys from the hanger at the door. He slipped them into the pockets of the checkered fleece he was wearing. Probably best on account of, well... He ruffled his short hair awkwardly. Laura ushered up the twins, and together they all stepped outside, the wind screaming briefly through the door. The sun was setting, and as it did, it scorched the sky red. What's wrong? Her mother asked. Now that they were alone, her voice had become soft and kindly. I just don't feel good, said Catherine. It wasn't exactly a lie. For the last year, she had woken every day with the same sinking feeling in her stomach, feeling the same sort of awful deep to the core of her being. Today wasn't any different in that regard. Her mother sighed, not out of impatience nor in her usual exasperated way, but more wearily, like she was trying to drag herself home after the end of a very long day. Catherine, please, she stressed. Can we just do this tonight as a family? When was the last time you even left the property? Catherine shrugged. What did it matter? We all miss you. That was ridiculous, thought Catherine. She was right here, the same as she always was, day after day. It wasn't her fault that no one in the family ever took the time to notice her. She communicated that with a sullen look at the floor and a light sweeping of her foot. Then, with a gentle cough and a light tremble she couldn't be sure was faked, sat down on the stairs. It's not my fault Tank's the only one who ever talks to me. She could barely get the old hound dog's name out before he rambled over to lay at her feet, resting his chin in her lap. Mother sighed again, pinching the bridge of her nose, but before she could say anything else, Paul returned. Twins are buckled up, Laura's with them. Jess is looking ready to try driving that car herself if we make her wait anymore. He forced a smile at the two of them. She's nattering worse than that Kit the other day. Catherine perked up. Their mother's mind was scattered, tracking a dozen things at once these days, but her eyes found her son. Oh, right, the foxes. Did you manage to trap them? Got the mother, Paul said. He rubbed at his shoulder awkwardly, in the telltale way he often did when trying to brace bad news. Catherine watched him from beneath the brim of her hat. Checked the snares again this morning. Must have miscounted the other night or something. His tongue clicked against his teeth. Looks like she's been out there a couple days now. Catherine jumped to her feet, and before she knew what she was doing, her brother was against the wall. She didn't have the strength to overpower him, not nearly, but he lacked the will to defend himself and only raised his hands apologetically. Bastard! She cried, ignoring her mother's protests about language. You promised you wouldn't hurt them. I didn't mean to, Cat. I'm sorry. Her brother looked genuinely distraught, but Catherine didn't care. The Kit and Vixen had been coming by the past few weeks, and she had taken to sneaking them leftovers from her plate. The amount she smuggled them was growing more and more lately. At first they had only followed her through the far bounds of the wheat field, cautious and curious, but soon she was leaving scraps of bread, eggs, bacon, sausage, and really anything else at all that she could get her hands on. She was even hoping to pet the Kit soon, who was growing bolder by the day. You knew I cared about them, she continued, thumping her arms at her brother's chest. Why did you take them? Why? Why? Her blows were softened by the thick fleece that wasn't his. Why can't you leave me anything? I didn't see the kid out there, Paul offered weakly. And I made sure the other traps were all clear. He's got to be out there somewhere. I'm sure he's okay. The traps are down now, all right? He'll be fine. I'm really sorry, Catherine. Don't! Catherine snapped, her eyes wide. Her finger was a knife pressing to his heart. You don't call me that. You're not him, no matter how much you might try to be. Paul slumped, his chin falling to his chest. No, I'm not, he said quietly. After a long silence, he slipped their father's old fleece off and hung it back over the door, reaching instead for his leather jacket. I'm not trying to be, you know. I know I can't be him. He looked around at the farmhouse, threatening to break from the strain of the storm. Someone's got to fill his boots. Catherine backed away, giving him space as their mother stood and watched wordlessly. This wasn't at all how anyone wanted the night to go. When Paul finally lifted his eyes from his boots, his face was back to the steady rock it had been since their father passed. I'll be waiting in the car when y'all are ready. The wind howled when he left. Catherine, that wasn't fair, her mother said. He's doing his best. That's all any of us can do. I'm just not feeling good, okay? Catherine pleaded. Shame burned in her face, and she hid it beneath the brim of her hat. She sat back on the stairs, burying her frustrations into Tank, who was soaking up her attention happily. She knew it was an unfair shot she'd taken at her brother, and she didn't need to be told that. But sometimes her words worked faster than her brain, and unkind things slipped out before she could catch them. She'd have apologized, if she could have. Please just let me stay home, Mom. Tell Paul I'm sorry. It'd mean more if you told him yourself. I can't, Catherine said. She might have been verging on tears if the world could make her feel anymore. I can't go out there tonight. I can't see that gravestone again. There was a silence between them that could have crossed oceans. It was too vast a feeling to grasp with words, even a year on. A wound too deep to measure. They had danced this dance many times now, and each time it only seemed to be getting worse. Everything was getting worse. Catherine knew her mother was counting on this night, knew how much she needed it, but she couldn't bring herself to go. It was now 1 year exactly since the passing of her father, and although she could grasp in theory what a memorial was supposed to be, in practice the whole idea just seemed absurd to her. She thought about nothing but her father these days, how his presence lingered in the walls that he built when he was young, and how his footsteps still seemed to drag through the halls in the dark of night over the floorboards he'd lain by hand. Why should she drive out to some lonely grave on a rainy night to stare at a name chiseled in stone atop a mound of dirt and bones, when the whole house stood in constant memorial to him? It didn't make any sense to her. The year wore on everyone else as well, of course. Laura had kept her head high and tried to pretend she was above everything, especially the place she so desperately wanted to leave behind. But still she returned after only her first month at college to help the rest of the family. Paul was doing everything he could to cover the farm duties, knowing their mother was inexperienced at most of the field work and was getting on in years. Together they had been the pillars holding up the family, but Catherine couldn't keep pace with her older siblings. She was done, and to ask her to take even one step outside that door tonight was like asking her to walk to the moon and back. She only won the argument because her mother was too tired to fight. The car horn was blaring, and through the window they could both see Jess pounding at the wheel while Laura and Izzy tried to hold her back. I noticed you didn't eat this morning, her mother said, her voice fighting to stay even. I left a plate for you in the kitchen in case you get hungry. She was going to leave. Catherine was going to get her way. But before she did, her mother turned, pulled her close, and hugged her tight. Her fingers felt over the grooves of Catherine's ribs. Try to eat something, okay? Could you do that for me? Sure, Mom. I love you so much. There was an immense shame growing inside of her, growing alongside what was already nestled in her stomach over the last year. There was still time to change her mind, Catherine knew, to grab her coat and sweater, to brush her hair, to sit through a night with her family the way things used to be. But she understood now that the only thing that never changes about life is that it's always changing, and rarely did she think it was for the better. Her father's ghost watched her from every corner of the old house. "I love you too, Mom," she said. "I'm sorry, I'll just rest now, okay? I'll be okay." Her mother nodded, wiping her tears with the edge of her sleeve and putting on the same brave smile she fought so hard to keep for everyone these days before turning to the door. Jess was still fighting to get at the horn, kicking at Laura while Izzy chattered away in his seat, probably trying to explain the costs and benefits of both their respective positions. After another moment, her mother was gone, and she watched through the window as the family finally gathered together in the car without her and set off down the way. Catherine buried her attentions on Tank for a while, sitting alone in the now silent home, before even he finally grew tired of her affections and went to find a nice spot to lay down on instead. Catherine walked through the house alone, tracing her fingers over walls she had known her entire life. She knew the particulars of the house, its eccentricities, better than anyone living. She had grown up in the shadow of her brothers and sisters. They needed more attention than her parents often said. Not that they ever said that in front of her exactly, but being the quiet one in a loud family meant you heard much more than you said, and Catherine had heard everything in this house. She'd heard how Paul had always planned to follow in the footsteps of their father, watched as he trailed along at his heels trying to learn the family fields. Paul was the oldest, and despite her reluctance, Catherine had to admit he had grown well into the role, even if it was far too soon. Only 2 years out of high school, and he was running the whole property, keeping it going for the family when their mother didn't have the strength. And she had heard every night just how much the responsibility was wearing on him, how much it took from him to stand as the pillar for everyone else to lean on. She shouldn't have said what she said. Catherine had listened through the walls as well about how Laura considered the farm beneath her, heard how she snuck away through her window almost every night to be with her friends waiting on the distant road, how she desperately wanted to follow that road as far away as it could take her. Catherine had listened through the walls as somehow the wild and unstudious Laura pulled herself together enough to earn a full scholarship and make it into her dream school, and then watched as she put it all aside and came back to the farm anyway when her family needed her. She was a sister to the twins now in a way she had never been to Catherine. Catherine had heard other things, too. She knew before the others did that their father was dying, listened to the panicked whisperings of her parents as talk of a bump beneath the skin slowly grew to hushed concerns on his increasingly pervasive cough, which he always tried to play off. She saw before the others did how his strength was sapping away by the day until he couldn't hide it from them any longer. Even after that, they had tried to downplay his sickness. She didn't know if it was for the benefit of the family or for their own peace of mind, if they were in denial somehow, but Catherine became very familiar with words like malignant, inoperable, and, eventually, terminal. She didn't understand why they wanted to hide this from everyone, and so one day she had finally exploded on them. On that day, alone in the woods, her father had seen through the burden that Catherine was trying to silently carry, knowing their secret, and tried to get her to open up about it. But if her father wouldn't talk about his problems, then she wouldn't either. He finally understood what Catherine must have learned because she was always so quiet and observant, and only to her did he explain why he had chosen to keep his illness quiet. It was a lesson she still struggled to understand. He told her that he wanted to spare his family any undue suffering, that he wanted to enjoy their days with them the same as he always had. Catherine argued that he was pretending things were okay when they clearly weren't, and her father didn't have an argument for that. Instead, he told her that he probably wouldn't live to see the winter. That was fine, he said, because autumn was always his favorite season anyway. It was his favorite, he told her, because it was a time of change, because it was the most beautiful of all the seasons, and because it was a time where the forest and nature quietly accepted their end. Catherine had yelled at him that day. She didn't understand. She told him that if he wanted to suffer alone, then he should die alone. And then she stormed away. Catherine had been the first to hear his breathing stop in the middle of the night. Now there was no one left in the house to overhear, save for Tank's labored panting nearby. The old hound dog trudged up the stairway to perch at its apex, guarding the long hall and looking over the door as he frequently did. He had been with this place forever. When she was young, Catherine knew that he kept her safe from the things prowling outside the dark halls at night, the imaginary spooks and goblins from her stories. Lately, she wondered if the ghost of her father haunted the halls as well, his footsteps creaking and groaning in every storm. She meant to find out for herself. The sign at her bedroom door read Catherine's Corner. The K in corner was an intentional misspelling, born out of a long battle for her love of alliteration and her desire to show off her intelligence even as a child. She had written it herself 12 years ago when she was only 3. The uneven letters were steadied by her father's hand, who had handled all the different colors she demanded by memorized name. Burnt sienna, mahogany, cyan, and magenta, chosen not because they looked good together, but because they had names not commonly used by children, and so obviously they must be better than such simple colors as blue and orange and green. Her father smiled wryly as she worked that day. Everyone had always made note of just how mature young Catherine was for her age, how soft-spoken and polite she was, how she was so quiet that you could almost be forgiven for not even noticing she was there. And almost no one ever did notice her, save for her father. No one would miss her now. The hardest part was how difficult it was becoming to remember his face the longer the days passed. More and more she could only remember the person he'd become rather than the person he was. When she really tried, she could make out sometimes a glimpse of a tall man astride a tractor, kind face and kinder eyes riding high through golden fields of wheat. Most other times, however, she only saw the skeleton of the man that remained, and that figure haunted both the house and her dreams. The skeleton man in his days of drugs and sickness lived forever in the house now, sat high in his chair, laid in his bed, stood in his fields, as if every piece of the property held tight only to those final, bitter memories. Even her forlorn face in the mirror reminded her too much of him, and so she'd stopped looking at it. Her window was blocked as well, the curtains held shut by 2 long nails. Once, in the days immediately after her father's passing, Catherine had looked out to the field when she heard the tractor running. She didn't know what she expected to see out there, surely he hadn't come back, but still her heart lifted for a moment at the sight of the fleece and hat above the fields. Soon enough she realized it was only her brother, working their father's old routine and wearing his old clothes again in pale imitation of the man, and so she swore never to look out the window again. Catherine's sole solace was to bury herself in books. Even then, one of the final surprises in the days after her father's passing was learning he had left her a vast collection, many of which were his own childhood favorites. She rarely saw him so much as glance at a newspaper when she was a child, and so to learn that he had been such a voracious reader in his youth came as a shock. The more she thought about it, however, the more she could only bemoan the lost opportunity. They were related in such a fundamental way, and she didn't even know it until after he was gone. She relived the adventures that had shaped him as a child through reading his old stories, and in a way it helped her to understand the man who had given everything for his family. His stories all featured stoic heroes carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders, sacrificing their own happiness in the name of helping others. Every new book she read was a further insight into the man that she had never really known. But the final thing she learned, the thing that really tore at her, was that he had tried to write a book of his own. Buried deep in his collection, she had discovered the scattered notes and drafts of an unpublished manuscript. She was so confused to find them at first that she didn't even realize who it might belong to, until she saw her father's signature scrawled on the final page. Despite her seeming knowledge of all the secrets of the farmhouse, Catherine had never known of her father's desire to be a writer, nor did she know of his talent for it. While his words were unpolished and his vocabulary limited, his imagination was as fertile as the acres of the farm, boundless in their life and depth. The manuscript had been left to her specifically, hidden between the pages of his most favorite books. Catherine wasn't sure if even her mother knew of their existence. They both harbored the same dream of living in the fantastical worlds of their stories. It was an impossibility, of course, another great injustice of life, and the sort of soul-crushing truth that could lead one to settle for a life of self-sacrifice. To know your own desired happiness would forever be unattainable painted a bleak picture of the future, and Catherine finally realized that she wanted none of it. In another world, another life, another path down the road, the manuscript might have served to fill the missing pieces of her heart after her father passed. Instead, it only tore them wider. She picked up the last pages still lying open on her bed and continued from where she left off. She read until the sun was down. It wasn't the first time she had finished the story, but still, every time she returned to it, she hoped there would be a little more somehow. She cried as she always did at the end of a good story, but tonight her tears had twofold reason. She cried at the end of stories as a way of saying goodbye to the people and places she had come to love, but tonight she cried as well for the final dream left to her by her father, which, much like his own life, had come to a sudden, devastating halt. Catherine had made her decision months ago. There were things to be done. She had decided that a soft death, something easy and comfortable of her own choosing, where she wouldn't have to face too much pain or fear, would be for the best. Rather than suffer in death as she had in life, she wanted instead to simply slip away. Tank came to greet her as she left her bedroom for the last time, and stuck by her side as she walked the house. Even clouded with age, his old eyes could still pierce her to the core. Her father had always taught Catherine to keep a few extra treats on hand at all times, which he explained was the secret as to why all the animals of the farm loved him, and so she pulled a few kibbles from her pocket. Tank sank to the floor and crunched away, content. She gave him a long scratch and then a hug before continuing down the hall. The note had been written last month. Catherine spent days agonizing over it, trying to get the words perfect, even though she knew that there was nothing that could be said to make things right. All she could hope for was her family's understanding, and maybe their forgiveness. There was great debate inside her as to where she would leave it for them. A solitary envelope sitting by the front door would surely be mistaken as simple mail, and might be overlooked before they found her. She could leave it pinned to the front door, but that might provoke ill feelings, as if the family were returning home to the opening of a mystery or even a horror novel. Besides, with the weather the way it was, she would risk losing the note in the wind anyway. She could leave it in her room, maybe, at her desk or tucked neatly on her bed on top of her pillows. She could leave it on the bookshelf, her most favorite place, but she couldn't be sure anyone would even notice it there. Most importantly, she didn't want the wrong person to find it, or, more importantly, her. If the twins walked in on her unknowingly, well, she wouldn't do that to her family. Although it seemed unceremonious, she finally decided to pin the note to the outside of the bathroom door, where no one would be able to miss it before finding her. The old grandfather clock downstairs chimed 9. Catherine hurried her pace. She had been so drawn into her father's last words that she had lost track of time entirely. Normally, to slow down and immerse oneself would be the mark of a good story, but now it only meant that she was pressed for time. The family would be returning soon, even if they stopped for dinner or dessert at the diner along the way. She had to hurry. The wide bath always took some time to fill, so she started that first, letting the water run as hot as it would go. Catherine always hated the cold. It was the thing she feared most about death. A knot twitched in her stomach. Was it nerves? Excitement? Maybe she was feeling the distance between idea and execution, now that the moment was drawing close. Instead, she decided that what she felt had to be hunger. Tiptoeing downstairs, as if walking too loud might bring the family home even sooner, she felt blindly over the familiar table and chairs as she walked through the dining room. She couldn't turn on the lights and risk facing what she was leaving behind. It was easier to leave things in the abstract. Even in the dark, she knew the place well enough that she found her mother's plate with no trouble. Grease smeared over her fingers as she ran them over sausage and bacon and congealed piles of creamy scrambled eggs. She felt around further on the plate until she felt the cold but still soft sponge of a large chocolate pancake, and downed it with a large glass of water, because despite pancakes being her favorite, they also always left her with hiccups. She hadn't come down this way much over the past year, instead picking at leftovers abandoned around the house by her siblings whenever they weren't looking. She couldn't face the kitchen anymore, or see the empty chair at the head of the table. That was where her father sat, and she still expected to see him there now. With her eyes closed, wandering through the dark room with the lights out, Catherine thought she could still feel his gaze on her. "I'm sorry, Dad," she whispered. "I'll see you soon." There was one more thing she needed to do first. It might be a selfish choice, she knew, but the time she had remaining was for her alone. Catherine took her father's fleece from the door as she went upstairs. The tub was running high by the time she returned to the bathroom, steam rising into the air and turning slick along the tile walls before running back down to the floor. The antique mirror on the wall was misting, so Catherine wouldn't have to see herself tonight, but she wiped a spot clean anyway. A tangle of bushy brown hair greeted her, tufting out from beneath the straw hat. Dull brown eyes watched from behind bent and taped circular lenses with a sadness and anger that had become her entire world. Her face was delicate and slim, usually feminine, but had become more pointed and harsh in her famine. When she looked in the mirror, all she could see was everything she hated about herself. So she took off her hat, took a pair of scissors from the medicine cabinet, and started to hack furiously at the tangles and knots in her hair, cutting down near to the scalp as she threw her wild mane into the wastebasket. When the basket filled, she stomped it down and then cut some more. Half-starved, she looked half a boy, and with her hair nearly gone, the illusion was complete. Absurdly, she felt guilt for that more than anything else. Her mother had always complimented her hair as a child, telling her how long and beautiful it was, and helping her to brush it every day. But with her hair gone, her curves starved to flatness, and wearing her father's hat and fleece, Catherine thought she looked at least a little like him. The face she had almost forgotten was almost there in the mirror, looking back at her sadly. She tried to look for the strength and kindness that had always lit her father's features, but failed to see it. Catherine hated everything about Catherine, and so it was time to leave her behind. Something inside her croaked in defiance, however. "Caterpillar?" her reflection said with her father's voice. His old nickname for her, the only name she'd ever accepted, and the name no one else could use again. She was ready to let go of this world. She kept the scissors with her as she slipped off the fleece, slipped off her clothes, and slipped into the tub. The water was near boiling and hissed as it scalded her red. She was afraid now that the moment was here, but at least she wouldn't be cold. The scissors were sharp, and they did their work quickly. One fast cut down the wrist. The scalding water numbed her to the pain, and she watched the blood start to blossom through her wound as if it were happening to someone else. Nothing could hurt her as much as the last year had anyway, and now nothing would hurt her ever again. The water was staining red, and when she tried to hold the scissors in her other hand to finish the job, it raised out of the water only limply before falling back to the bottom of the tub. She was starting to feel cold. She didn't want to be cold. The scissors were lost in the water, lost in the growing red cloud. Caterpillar reached her working hand over the side of the tub to the fleece that had been her father's and held its checkers tight. And then the water was rising, and she was helpless to keep her head above it. She heard Tank scratching furiously at the door, howling as she sank into the tub. She was scared. She was cold. She was going to die. In the moments before her vision went black, she realized that everything she feared had come to pass anyway, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. There was no turning back. And then, with that final thought to haunt her, she was gone.